photographing the mundane. I took this photo for a really odd reason, like not because I thought it might be good, but because, well, back when I only photographed portraits and weddings, if I had to take a photo of something other than a person, this is exactly the sort of subject I would have looked for, and exactly the way I would have composed it. Wide and symmetrical. Although I did not quite nail my symmetry, I couldn't help but notice. So I guess I just sort of did it as a goof, or just to see if I could slip back into that way of thinking. Or maybe as a way of saying to myself, like, hey, look how far I've come. But that was my concept for bringing some type of interest to the mundane. Whereas now I would do something a little bit more like this, still following lines and whatnot, but a little bit more freeform in my approach. And yeah, bring interest too. I'll get back to that little nugget in a bit. I have lots to say about that idea. But you see, I also had no interest in photographing mundane things at the time. And now I feel entirely different about it. And sure, I'd love to travel and have a crack at shooting something world-class in some amazing place or of some amazing circumstance, but that's just not my reality. But isn't it more appealing anyway just to start with something really ordinary and to turn it into something amazing? If you start with something amazing and then you end up with an amazing photo of it, yeah, well, what have you done? What have you actually contributed, other than not screwing it up? Well, this may just be a case of me making lemons out of lemonade. That's not it. Oddly kind of fits, though. But a good photographer of the mundane is what I aspire to be these days. I don't think I am that, but that is very much what I'd like to be. Handful of years ago, I undertook this huge scanning project, 13,000 negatives, belonging to my mom, her mom, and her dad, in the context of spending a bunch of time dealing with, experiencing their work, which felt so honest, so real to me. I realized every photograph ever to come out of my camera is just utter bullshit, just fake, phony contrivances. And I'm just getting it so very wrong, trying to be clever with my camera, but nothing I've done actually represents me, my experience, hopes, fears, my take on something. Nothing substantive at all. That was super apparent seeing 3 lives so fully realized and documented, and all accomplished with an outward-facing camera. In other words, not photos of them, but photos from their perspective and how they see the world. And so not only have I failed spectacularly to do something similar myself, I didn't even know that was the goal. They seem to all understand it innately, independently. And me, I just didn't get the memo. Yeah, I want to photograph mundane things because life is a collection of mundane things, and those are the things that matter when you're faced with the prospect of leaving. I came to know, I felt, my grandma, who I'd never met. I came to understand my grandpa, who I'd only met a few times. And I have this avenue of connection that's so valuable to me with my mom, and all through their work, what they chose to photograph and in what way. It's really interesting, kind of powerful, and such an indication that I've spent so many years just getting this all so profoundly wrong. But for a while I took this inspiration a little too literally, where I got super wrapped up in shooting film, not because it's a trendy thing to do right now. If anything, it being trendy would have the opposite effect on me, and cause me to want nothing to do with analog film. But the experience of handling their negatives had a fairly profound effect on me. I wish I could do better, but the word that describes how this all felt is real. It felt so very real. So whether or not it was or is trendy ultimately just didn't matter and had no bearing on my enchantment with film over the last several years. This notion of fear of missing out, which has its own obnoxious acronym. Not only have I never experienced that, I actively experienced the reverse. Fear of being included. I don't know if I'm just wired that way or if it comes more from my wacko religious upbringing. But I love individuals, love them, cherish them, respect them immensely. So in that sense, I truly do like people. But a group of people is something entirely different. A scenario where individuals voluntarily give up their individuality. What? Why would you ever do that? A group is a big, dumb, boorish, worst-case scenario version of humanity. Voluntarily stupid. I tend to think, oh, if that many people like this thing, it must be the worst thing ever. I'll definitely steer clear. This is, of course, not always true, and thus my instincts sometimes work to my detriment, but also to my benefit at times. But I really try not to be instinct-driven, as though I were a caveman. I have a brain, and occasionally I like to give that sumbitch a workout. Throw a couple tasks up there. Actually, people don't have a brain. They are a brain, but whatever. So this giant box of negatives in my closet, I wanted to contribute something to it. But the expense of shooting film and the time involved, particularly if you can't handle the expense, you can make it up on the time end, developing and scanning yourself. But it became oppressive. I haven't shot any film in quite a while. I do think my attraction to drone photography, this drone-assance I'm experiencing, has an awful lot to do with what I'm talking about. It's just such a simple, stripped-down version of a camera. I can't hide behind technique, style. I don't have a bag of tricks to pull from. It really just comes down to the fundamentals. Composition, exposure, subject selection, time of day / luck regarding weather and lighting conditions. So lately I've been going out with a traditional stills camera, a couple of lenses, and the drone, and I just put the drone up in the air and I alternate back and forth between the two. And I haven't yet got a handle on what is exactly the perfect mixture of drone when I'm doing still photography videos. And therefore I've started a separate drone channel, because there will be times I just want to go out and play with my drone. And why deny myself that experience? And although related, they are separate topics, separate interests. So it just made sense to start a solo drone channel. I was out here a little too late, lost track of time. It got to be too dark, and the coyotes started growling at me to warn me I was in violation of the treaty, and they'd be justified in eating me if I stayed much longer. Hopefully they were coyotes and not something worse, in the sense of more likely to eat me. Don't care for the blob of foreground at the bottom of the frame here. That just looks like a mess. I don't know if maybe I wasn't seeing it in the camera and it became more apparent on the screen. I'm not sure. It just wasn't a great shot. But to wrap up my thoughts on film, I will absolutely, I'm sure of it, shoot film again at some point, at various points. It's not as though I make this decision and this is the one and only thing I'll do until the day I die. Variety is great. I get bored easily. I need variety. But it's absolutely the case that there's a larger issue at play with my decision to back away from film. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's time-consuming. But the reason my grandma, my grandpa, my mother shot on film is because that was the medium of their time, and that is not the medium of this time. I mean, to shoot on film is to go out of your way to do something different than the mainstream, and that's awesome. Good on you for doing that. But my doing it just felt like yet another gimmick, getting in the way of what I was trying to accomplish. My mom didn't have to rely on past technologies to try to invoke some sense of familiarity or nostalgia. She gave it no thought. She just used what was available, went to work, and her photography is honest and pure to its very core. I love shooting film. It's great fun. It's special, even. The process and the results bring me joy. But that isn't my day-to-day strategy anymore. But here's my ultimate point. kind of got there when I was talking about the drone. But the phrase I used earlier, bring interest to, that's the thought I'm questioning or troubled by. It is absolutely my instinct as a photographer to try to, contextualize a thing in some way so as to increase the visual interest of that thing with respect a viewer. But, as uncomfortable as it may be for me to even consider this, is that really the most honest approach? Really? Or am I trying to win points with my cleverness? An argument could be made, I suppose, that following your instinct is always the right thing to do in an art-type scenario, but also refer to what I said earlier about outgrowing one's dopey instincts, rising above an ancestral cave-dwelling level of decision-making. I think it's not entirely gross from an artistic standpoint to let your brain enter the process a bit. Think some things through. And here's where that leads, an uncomfortable place. How much style, how much technique is too much? When does it detract from the simple, honest, unadulterated reality I'm hoping to capture in the first place? And conversely, how little is too little, resulting in an utterly boring snooze fest of an image? Is it even possible to have style and substance in one package, or does style always undercut the substance, the way that comedy undercuts drama? Comic relief may be crowd-pleasing, but refer back to my feelings toward crowds. I met this super nice guy while I was out here, way into photography but doesn't own a camera, possibly down on his luck. If you have an old camera that you don't think you'll ever use again, I bet you he could put it to good use. I'll leave his Instagram info in the description. But here's a quick example of me actually, once upon a time, managing to get the balance right. And then ultimately, I think, getting lost again. But I think somewhere in there is a good lesson. I made this short film, and within the making of that film, almost immediately actually, maybe even instinctively, I realized that the absolute shallowest depth of field possible on my lenses, which I felt looked great for portraits, looked absolutely ridiculous in the context of the film I was making, or maybe even any film. But I was going for a realistic vibe, and using that technique robbed it of its reality. Instead of shooting wide open, I stopped down 2 or sometimes more stops, still shallow-ish, but it didn't call so much attention to itself. And for a time, this did spill over into my portrait photography work, where I was certainly still going for subject-background separation, but a little bit deeper depth of field seemed like more grown up to me, less gimmicky. But over the course of 3 or 4 years, I kind of just gradually slid back into shooting primes wide open all the time. I also realized, similarly, that perfect portrait lighting on the actors' faces at all times looked ridiculous, and my insistence on that would only undercut the reality I was trying to convey and serve my own ego as a stills photographer. Like, see, my light is always perfect. Instead, I chose to do what was best for the project, and I embraced janky lighting. Same with my favorite take in terms of camera work versus actors' performances. I had to get over myself, but I always chose based on performance, even if the camera work was a little subpar. These were grown-up decisions. So see, I am capable of making grown-up decisions. But along the way, I lost it all over again. So what's an example of a photo of the mundane, the type I'm talking about? I'm certainly not talking about photos of your own family. I think that's fairly obvious as a subject. In a very real and grand sense, I don't know. I probably wouldn't find it all that interesting to talk about if I did know. But I feel like I'm discovering the answer anytime I leave with my camera, to just go shoot whatever I choose. And I'd say you certainly can't go wrong if your intention is capturing a place, a time, as only you can, as a resident of that time and place. And everything seemingly boring will eventually become an interesting relic. But it doesn't have to become a relic in order to have value. Some things are just worth doing because they are.